Now, at the end of this video, I want to tell you the story about when I did President Bush W's portrait back in 2008, and I had a real, almost a crisis in trying to find good light, and I'll tell you the story about that at the end of this video. So in this video, I want to talk about how to achieve good lighting on your subject matter, whether that's a portrait or whether it's a still life or whatever it is. Now, I should start by telling you that everybody has different taste, so I'm not going to tell you exactly what I think is the best, or I can tell you what I personally like, but really the emphasis on this video is to explain to you how you can understand light and how you can achieve the lighting that you want. So in other words, let's start by talking about what I think is the classic lighting, which and in this case we're talking about portraits, and this would be the lighting that when you get your school yearbook photo done, like you can see here in these images, it's light coming from the top, and it can be the left or the right, but it's coming from not directly in front, but kind of off to the side and in front of you and up high. And that light, because it's coming like this, will allow some shadow creation on the nose and on the jaw and everything else. Now, you don't want that light to be super hard light, and hard light meaning that it comes from a single point. So like this light here is a single point of light. The sun actually is a single point of light, which is why, you know, taking photographs out in full sun is not generally, doesn't generally work very well at all. This is what you get if you photograph somebody in full sun. And you can see how dark the shadows are, and that's because the part of the face that's well lit is so much brighter than the shadow side that in order to get a good exposure on the light side, you end up making the shadows black or almost black, like you can see in this image. Now, the sun, like I said, is a single point of light, as opposed to a source of light that's big and wide and broad. So if you look at these lights here, these photographer lights, you can see that they are not a single point of light, but rather they come from a very large area. And so the bigger, if you're talking about a point of light like the sun, and even though the sun is big, it's so far away that when its light comes, it's really like a point of light. And if you look at this fire hydrant shadow on the sidewalk here, you can see that it's very sharp. In other words, you got shadow and then highlight with no soft blend between the two. And that's a result of a single point of light. In general, you want a soft light. Now, unless you like having sharp lines on your shadows, you know, there are people that might actually like that, but for the most part, soft light is better because you get these soft shadow lines like you see here. Now, one really important consideration is if you have a primary light source that's coming like this, and the background in the room is very dark, then you're going to get black shadows, because the shadows on somebody's face, now we're talking about a single source of light as opposed to multiple sources of light. But if you have a single source of light, the shadows are going to be completely black unless you have reflection coming off of walls or the floor or even somebody's shirt. And that reflection off of the background will light up the shadow part so that you can see into the shadow. And you don't have to see very much in the shadow, but just a little bit of detail is better than having what I call, or what is known as crushed blacks. Crushed black means the shadow is just black, 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 with no detail at all, like you can see in this image here. And so you always want to be able to see a little bit into the shadow. I mean, unless you're just, you know, really trying for some effect or something. You don't want your shadows to be crushed black. You want to be able to see some detail in there. And a lot of times that can be achieved just by reflective light. So even in this video that you're watching of my face, I have a strong light, which is up here, up to my left and up high, which means that it's coming down and I'm getting a little bit of shadow on my nose as it comes across and shadow underneath my jaw, and that's what helps define my face. If you had light coming from all directions, you wouldn't have any shadow and you wouldn't be able to see the structure of my face as well. So basically, this light, and this is the only light that I have in the room, but because there's other light areas, they're reflecting off of the floor and off of the walls, and that's why my shadow side of my face is not black, black, black. And there's a lot of different ways you can achieve that, and I'm going to go through a whole bunch of examples of good light and trying to understand what's happening with the light. But I just want to give you general advice here, and that is that you primarily want a soft light up high and to one side or the other, and then you either need to have a secondary light filling in, and that could be like a window over on the left, or even a white wall that's being illuminated by your primary light source, but you need some other light coming in and filling in the shadow so it's not black, black. Now, one of the things that photographers use, and I have never liked this, and that is what they call filler light. So filler light is having a primary source and then having a secondary light source, like not reflective light off the wall, but literally a light bulb that's filling in the shadow. And the problem with that is that if you want to see natural color in that shadow, like if you look at this image here, the shadow on this man's face is not filler light. It's not just neutral gray. It's got an orange or warm tone to it, and that's because the light is reflecting off of the walls, reflecting off of his clothing, and giving you that natural filler light, as opposed to an artificial filler light, which doesn't have any color. And when you use an artificial filler light like that, which a lot of photographers use, you end up getting a face that looks like it's stuck on the background or that it doesn't belong. So that's just some general things, but now let's go through these images here and let's talk about all these different types of lighting on people's faces. And this would apply to still life, like a vase or anything really. But a human face is really the best way to sort of see what the light is doing. It's just like the perfect sculpture with a lot of different features. So let's go through these images and let's talk about how you achieve all these different types of lighting. Now, very quickly, before I do that, I want to tell you that I have never used a formula for figuring out my light. In other words, when I used to do portraits, I was tempted often to just go buy a light and set up my lighting so that I could just put up my lights and I get the same light every single time. But I always thought if I use a formula like that, all my portraits are going to be the same, and I wanted to have more variety, and the very best way to come up with variety is just to look for it. In other words, I would arrive at somebody's home. I would first of all tell them to turn off all the interior lights of the house and only use the window light. And that generally works because you end up getting something different, something that's not contrived, something that you didn't think about, and you discover all these interesting light that you would have never been able to think of on your own. So you walk into a room and somebody's standing in a hallway and the light's hitting them from here, and then there's a window back in the back putting some backlight reflection on their cheek or whatever it is. But it's really hard to contrive light and have it come out as interesting as if you go and you just discover it and look for it. So when I would arrive in somebody's house, I would just have them walk all over the house and stand them in the hallway, stand them in the living room, even stand them in the kitchen or wherever it was, and I would really focus on trying to find really interesting light on their face. And one little trick that I used to use in the early days, and I didn't use it as much later, I guess because I kind of figured out how to see it, but what I used to do is roll up a magazine and look through the magazine and look at their face and close one eye and just try to imagine it like it was an oil painting, and then I would decide whether I liked the lighting or not. And that helped me. I don't know why that helped me, but that's something that I used to do. All right, let's go through some of these images here. So I wanted to start by showing you sort of the classic lighting, and you can see that here in this woman. She's sitting by a window. The window is a high window. It's not a low window, so it's coming in from primarily the top. and that's why you can see the way the shadow plays on her nose. You get a little bit of shadow line. Her neck is in shadow. So this is classic lighting. This is the same lighting that I used very often in my portraits. When I would come to somebody's home, I would always tell them, turn off all the interior lights, and then I would sit them by a window and look at the light there. And that was sort of my backup plan. In other words, I would always know that I could go back to putting somebody by a window, have the light come from the side and a little bit from above, and basically get decent light almost every time. The biggest problem with that is that when you photograph somebody in good lighting like this, a lot of times the shadow side might be too dark, and in which case you need lighter background around in the room, like not just like dark walls, but you can even put, you know, like a reflector off to the left or whatever, something to throw some light into their face. But generally that comes from the room itself. So if you have really good light, the room itself will be reflecting enough light into the shadows, and that's why when you look at this portrait that I painted here, you can see that the shadow side of her face is not completely black, black, black. And this lighting was used by the masters. Here's a Rembrandt painting. It's that same kind of light coming from high above and to one side and creating the shadow underneath his chin and also on his to the right of his nose. This is John Singer Sargent, same kind of lighting. Here he's got this white wall behind her, so that's throwing a little bit of light into the shadow. The reason that the shadows on this woman's face are not black, black, black is because it's getting reflective light filling in that shadow. Here's a portrait of Benjamin Franklin, same deal, same classic lighting. And let's just go through a few more. This one, as you can see, the reflection coming off of her light colored clothing, and that's putting that reflection into the bottom of her chin. This one here is just the classic light. She has her face turned toward the window slightly, which is allowing the light to hit her cheek on the left and also her eyes. The little bit of light that you see on her ear and also the light lighting up her jawline on the bottom left is coming off of her light-colored clothing. Here's another one. Now this one, the shadow side of this woman's face is almost black, but because it's you can see just a little bit, it works perfect. So this is really nice lighting, even though the shadow side is really dark. As long as you can see a little bit in there, you're basically good to go. Here's another one. This is just classic window light, primarily coming from above. Nice shadows on the face. And here's one more. Classic window lighting. Now this light on this man's face is actually hard light, so it's basically direct sunlight coming through either a shade or a window, and you can see that it's direct sunlight or that it's hard light by looking at the shadow coming off of his nose and see what a hard line that is. But it still works. It's still a beautiful photograph, and it has the blacks are not crushed, so on the dark side of his face you can still see detail. Just another classic lighting, just a little bit of glow on the cheek and a little bit of glow in the eye is all you need. This one is just about crushed black, but it still works because we can see the eye and the shadow, but some people might think that this is too much shadow, too much dark, but it's a matter of taste. Here's another one, just real classic lighting. And that shadow on her face is being illuminated by the reflection, or rather the light coming off of the door. This is really side light, so it's not so much coming from directly above. And you can see the shadow in her eye on the right side, but it's not, it still looks fine. It's really good light. This is sort of, you know, right side of her face is lit, the left side of her face is in shadow. And this is a portrait that I did, which is doing that same kind of lighting. Light on the left, and then secondary light coming off of the walls, illuminating the shadow side of her face. And you'll notice her right eye, or our left eye as we look at it on the highlighted side of her face, there's a real dark spot in there, but you can still barely see the white of her eye, which makes it nice. And I really love this lighting. Same thing, this is just a photograph version of that lighting, primarily coming from the side. And then that little bit of glow that you see on his face on the very left side there is coming off of the cloth behind him. So it's a little bit of backlighting. Another really good place to photograph people is outdoors, and you can be in full sun and you put them under the shade of a tree, and that way you can get some light like you see here in this photograph. Just really nice light, but it's because she's under the shade of a tree that this works. Here's another version of that. Now this lighting is coming very slightly from below, and if you get too much of that, it's, you know, maybe not what you want, but this is just really wonderful lighting, and it's all about utilizing the shade of a tree outdoors. And this is full sun, but it doesn't matter because none of the full sun's actually hitting his face. Another example of photographing somebody under a tree, and this is just unique lighting. Her face is, this is lighting that I would never have contrived myself or thought of it, but you start moving somebody around, you put them under a tree, and all of a sudden you have this very interesting light, which just a little bit of light catching the tip of her nose, on top of her forehead, but basically it's very soft light, but for some reason it works. Another great place to photograph people is inside of a large, like inside of a garage or inside of a barn where you have a big opening, like a door open, and then the light, and the person is not standing directly in the light, but that light coming from the very large door is coming in and lighting them. As you can see here, this woman in the barn, and then also this one here, this woman inside of a garage. So it's really beautiful light, even though it's very soft, meaning it comes from many different directions, not just a pinpoint of light. Another place that you can photograph people, and this actually usually is very difficult, and that is under cloudy skies. If you have just somebody standing out in a field under cloudy skies, it's very hard to make the lighting work because it's just too soft, just coming from everywhere. This is an example of that, but in this case, she has her head tilted down and her hair is causing a shadow. But as you can see, her eyes are kind of dark, and the shadow side of her neck is really, really dark. But there's just really, it's just that it's too soft, and you can really see that here in this picture here. It's not that this is bad lighting, but it's just so soft, and you also have to start to worry about the eyes getting dark. So if you look at this one here, really soft lighting, but his eyes are the only thing that's, you know, dark, that and underneath his nose. But it's just like in general, you don't want somebody's eyes to be really dark, hiding in shadow like this. Another great place to photograph people is in cities, and that's just because, as you can imagine, with all these tall buildings, you're basically almost always in shadow, but you, depending on where you place people next to a building or out in the middle of, you know, the sidewalk or whatever it is, you can find all kinds of interesting lighting. It's just a matter of moving people around and trying all these different lightings. As you can see, these are all downtown, and they're all a little bit different. This lighting here on this man's face is just perfect lighting. It's very interesting. You have the blue coming from the sky, the indirect lighting from the sky, which is the primary lighting, and then in the shadow, it's less blue, so you get this interesting, nice colors, and everything is well defined. This is another person in a city. I would say this light is maybe a little too soft in general, but pretty good lighting, I would say. And here's another man in the city, and in this case, his eyes are a little too dark, I believe. Another case of eyes being too dark. Now, another good place is in cities to, you know, photograph somebody is inside of an alleyway where you have light coming in from one side, but then the rest blocked. And as you can see here on this man's face, this is really wonderful lighting. It's just taken in an alleyway of a city. Now, this is an example of direct sunlight, and as you can see, the shadows on this woman's face are too dark, so they're like crushed black, but it isn't always bad light. This one here, this woman is in direct light, and the lighter parts of her face are a little overexposed, which is not good, but the shadow side of her face, I don't know where that light's coming from, off of a tree or off of a building or whatever, but because that secondary light is filling in the shadow side of her face, it actually works pretty well. This is an example of light coming from below. So it's like the classic, horror movie type of lighting. You put a flashlight underneath your chin, and when the light comes from below, it's just the opposite of what we're used to. So it has a certain effect, and this is what they use in horror movies all the time to get that sort of, scary light. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that. I actually like the lighting on this woman's face here, and this one also. Is just kind of different and unique. I don't like the way the shadow is playing, coming off of her nose. So maybe it's not the greatest light, but again, it's just light from below, which in general you want to avoid unless you're just trying for some effect. Now this is what you would call backlighting, meaning the light's like actually behind the person. And it's very difficult to make that work. As you can see, the light on her forehead is overexposed and blown out a little bit, but you can tolerate that to a certain degree, especially because the light is so nice on her cheek. And that light on her lips is really nice. Under her chin, you can see the glow. So I really like this light. So backlighting can be very interesting. It's just really hard to achieve. You can see here, I love this photograph, but the shadow side of her face is quite dark. But I actually love this one. This is just another example of backlighting. Again, you got to be able to get some light into the main parts of the face, but it just makes for a beautiful type of light. And this is sort of backlighting. This is kind of like next to a window, but it's coming sort of from behind him. So it's just another version of backlight. But as you can see, the shadow side of his face has some detail. We can see his ear. We can see his hairline, and just a little bit of that is really all you need. So standing in a hallway is always a good place to try lighting, and this is an example of that. Really beautiful light on her face. This one here is a little bit overexposed, so I think it's a little too light. The lightest parts of her face are almost titanium white, which is too light. But it's decent light, and it's actually a point of light, and so you can look at the shadow on her neck and underneath her nose and see the hard line. So that's a point of light, but still looks pretty good. I think it's decent lighting. So point of light lighting is not always bad. And this is another one in a hallway, just unique, interesting. This one here was also taken in a hallway, but as you can see, the lightest part of her face is too bright, I believe, and you got to be careful. You don't want the lightest parts of somebody's skin to be titanium white. That's too bright. So this one is a little bit overexposed. This one is very overexposed. So this was exposed, I believe, so that the shadow side of her face looked good. But the problem with it is now the highlighted side of her face is completely blown out and white, and doesn't have any color in it at all. So this is an example of an overexposed image of a person. But this is very common, and that's because people are looking at that shadow and they don't want it to be too dark, so they lighten up the shadow, and in the process they blow out all the highlights. So this is an example of a not good photograph. Another great place to photograph people is inside large buildings, or like cathedrals are great, or big churches, or anything that has big high windows where the light's primarily coming from above. But I just love this lighting right here. It's just unique and different, and I love the color of it. Her eye on the right is maybe in a little bit too much shadow. You can see the sort of the bag under her eye, as people would say. But I think it's great. A wonderful photograph. I really love it. Here's another example of lighting inside of a cathedral. Just really beautiful. Now, this is not something that I would have been able to contrive myself. It's just interesting light. It's just wonderful. There's also a lot of light that it can't really define, just different. And this is an example of that. I really love the lighting on her face, but she has that hard shadow on the right. She's got shadow on the left. And it's just, for whatever reason, it works. Here's another example of really interesting light. And this is just, creating a certain effect. I probably wouldn't paint somebody's portrait like this, but in terms of just interesting light that, creates some drama, I think it's beautiful. Another example of unique and interesting lighting. And again, you can look at the shadow of her face and you can barely see her eye and a little glow on the cheek, and that's all you need. Beautiful light. A couple other points to keep in mind if you are photographing somebody, and that is don't use a fisheye lens. And a fisheye lens is what's in your camera when you take a selfie, and it means that everything kind of gets distorted. You can see this picture here. This is your classic, close-up shot with a very fisheye lens. And a fisheye lens is basically like, anything 25 millimeters or even smaller. I like to shoot with a 50 millimeter to 100 millimeter lens, and that gives you enough distance from the subject where you're not getting any distortions. But yeah, 50 to 100 millimeters is about right. And then another tip that I would suggest is if you go to take somebody's photographs, or really if you're going to photograph anything, but when I used to photograph people, I would always bring with me a very light cloth, and I usually wouldn't use white because I liked a little bit of color in it, so I had a very creamy colored cloth that I would use, and I could throw that on the floor to throw some light into their face, or even hold it up on the side, or have somebody else hold it for me to get some reflection into the dark side of their face. I would also take with me a dark cloth, just a big, large dark cloth, so that if I had something that was too bright and I didn't like the way it was reflecting, I could cover that with the dark cloth. So that's really helpful to have. Now let me tell you the story about when I did President Bush W's portrait back in 2008. And what happened was, and this was like actually the worst crisis I ever had when I was in my whole portrait career. So what happened was they told me I could go into the White House on Wednesday, and they actually allowed me to photograph in every single room of the White House. So I walked around and I had somebody posing in every single room of the White House. And I was just taking pictures just to see what the light was doing so that I could figure out where I wanted to do the president's portrait. So I go all over the White House. I'm up in the residency. I went into the Lincoln bedroom. I went into every room in the White House pretty much, I think, except for bathrooms and maybe their bedroom. But other than that, they gave me full access. So I spent hours looking for this perfect lighting, and I found what I thought was great lighting, and that was up in the residency in the president's upstairs office. And for whatever reason, the lighting was just great. And then what happened was I came back on Friday when I was supposed to meet with the president. And when I went on Wednesday, it was a sunny, beautiful day. When I came on Friday morning, and I arrived a couple hours before I was supposed to meet with the president, I went to this room that I told them ahead of time that this is where I wanted to do it, and the light was great, and so we went upstairs, and I had somebody with me as a stand-in for the president because I had 1 hour with the president. So I had a good friend come with me before I met with the president so that I could see what the light was doing. And we got there and it was raining that day. It was one of these days that was like the darkest day. It may have been like maybe the darkest midday that I've ever seen in my whole life. It was one of those days that it felt like it was about to be nighttime because the cloud cover was so dark and so thick, and it was just raining all day long. So all the work I did on Wednesday by looking for the good light was just thrown out the window. So we arrive upstairs. I'm in the upstairs office in the residency, and I've got my friend, and we're looking at the light, and I'm telling him, stand here, stand there, and I see nothing. He even asked me, he says, what are you going to do? I said, I have no idea. Here I was about to meet with the president. He was going to be there in 30 minutes or whatever it was, and I could find nothing. And I really didn't know what I was going to do other than just take really bad pictures of him and see if I could make it work. So as I'm sitting there figuring this out and I'm starting to panic, in walks Laura Bush with a family friend, and she says, this is the portrait artist that's here to paint George's portrait. And I introduced myself, and she said to me, did you know that painting hanging over his desk was actually painted in this same room? And I looked at it, and all of a sudden I realized, oh, there he is, and he's got the window behind him, And she asked me, have you considered doing it from the very same spot, looking at the subject as that painting? And actually I hadn't. And when I looked at it, there's a big window behind the president. And I would never put a window behind somebody. In my whole portrait career, it was just kind of like, you don't even think about it, because we would never have a big bright window behind somebody in their portrait. So I didn't even consider that perspective. But I thought Laura had suggested it, so I said, well, we can try it. And so I was just sort of thinking, this will never work, but I asked my friend, stand right here. And when he stood right there, all of a sudden I realized it was so dark outside, it was so dark, that the chandelier that was in the room could act as my primary light source. And he had this dark desk, down to his left. And that dark desk created some nice shadow on his face, just enough. And so all of a sudden I thought, this might actually work. So that's actually how I ended up doing the portrait. So it was not my idea, it was actually Laura Bush's idea to do the portrait from that perspective. And I give her full credit. So here's the finished portrait of the president with the window behind him, which I think ended up working for the composition, and I was really happy with the way this turned out. And if you haven't been to Geneva Fine Art, we are increasing. We've got a new purple. We've just lowered our prices across almost every one of our colors is now less expensive because we have a great team that's making our paint now. And I believe it's the best paint in the world. Has the highest pigment load, meaning you get great coverage with less paint. And it's also ready to use out of the tube. It already has the medium mixed into it. It does not have solvents in it, so it has no harmful fumes whatsoever. So if you haven't checked out Geneva Fine Art, go do that at genevafineart.com. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.